In 2017, director Ralph Strain brought us Genesis Paradise Lost, the young Earth creation movie that is best known for bringing us a T-Rex eating a watermelon out of a tree.
Upon the earth, wherein there is life.
Back then, I produced a 12-part video response series called Science of Genesis Paradise Lost, which I recently remastered into one mega-cut video. Well, it's 7 years later, and Ralph is finally bringing us a sequel called Ark and the Darkness, which this time promises a T-Rex enjoying a swim while Noah's family floats on by. They really did miss out by not calling it Jurassic Ark. Now, this is not officially a sequel, because Genesis Paradise Lost was created in conjunction with Eric Hoven's Creation Today Ministries. You may recall all those videos where it seemed like Eric had Ralph in some kind of hostage situation.
Please pray. Please pray.
After the video came out, Eric and Ralph had a series of disagreements and lawsuits over distribution and sequel rights. So this time, Ralph partnered with Genesis Apologetics. You might recognize them from videos like this.
I am evolution. I am random chance accidents, the brainless, purposeless nothing, which somehow leads to everything.
I am creation. I show order and completion.
But the formula for this film is the same. A series of interviews with a number of individuals who have been somehow given PhDs from schools with a range of reputability. They all work for Answers in Genesis, Logos, or Liberty University, or are an unemployed high school teacher. That's right, Dr. J is back to say what the more reputable guests aren't willing to say in public. And like Genesis Paradise Lost, between interviews there are sweeping cutscenes of reasonably impressive animation to provide visual interest and the artifice of reliability.
On the sixth day, he made all of the majestic land creatures, which included all of the dinosaurs, along with mankind.
During production, the film crowdfunded to the tune of between $125,000 and $250,000, depending on the report. Ark in the Darkness got a theatrical release on March 10, 2024, and earned over $2 million. After a window of paid streaming and DVD sales, the producers recently posted the movie in full to YouTube for everyone to watch for free. As of the time of this recording, it's been viewed nearly 1 million times and counting. So while you may not have heard of the film, it has more reach than any other recent creation endeavor. If you're new to the channel, you should know that I spent most of my life as a young Earth creationist, fully accepting everything that Ark in the Darkness is going to profess, just taking it at face value. But after brushing against some dinosaur science that conflicted with my worldview, I wanted to read up on creation from ministries like Answers in Genesis in order to strengthen and defend my faith. But the opposite happened. I found that creationists were misrepresenting the science, and the God I believed in wouldn't need to lie, would he? So in that grand tradition, get out your popcorn and let's take a look at the science of Ark and the Darkness.
I think people don't believe in the flood today because they don't have access to the accurate information and evidences that are there.
The reason I don't believe in the flood today is because I read everything I could on the evidence for a global flood and found it wanting. That said, this is your chance to show me what I'm missing.
They are simply captive to entertainment, social media. There you have movies like Noah that in a very fictional and nonsensical way distorts the Bible totally.
Do you mean the Russell Crowe movie with the people made of rocks? I thought it creatively took the very limited information in the Bible and made some interesting extrapolations, particularly the idea that the animals could just be put to sleep for a year and to avoid all the logistical problems of caring for them on the boat. This idea makes the Ark Encounter attraction in Kentucky seem unnecessary, so I get the hard feelings.
We have, of course, the whole embedded presupposition of evolution and the geologic column and all of these things which tell students as they come along that the Earth has existed for millions, if not billions of years, that man is a product simply of natural succession.
Scientists generally presuppose only that natural laws are consistent and that empirical evidence can be used to understand the history of Earth and life. Evolution and the ancient Earth are conclusions based on extensive evidence from geology, biology, physics, and other fields, rather than presuppositions. On the other hand, in order to come to the conclusion that the Earth is approximately 6,000 years old and that all life forms were created in their present forms, one must begin with a presupposition that the Bible is a literal and infallible historical document. It is not derived from evidence, or there would be secular scientists somewhere who hold to a young Earth.
A flood is a supernatural event. A flood is a divine judgment. A flood destroyed mankind.
Honestly, the makers of this film should have paid attention to this. The flood is a supernatural event. They should lean into that and answer logistical questions with "God did a miracle" as the answer. That would be much less problematic than their pseudoscience half explanations that tend to avoid data and cause people like me to doubt. God did it is less satisfying, but would at least be universally plausible.
And they're not told that there are evidences of these things. They aren't shown the historicity of Genesis to say that this holds up very well in terms of our scientific age.
Let's see.
So it's simply, on the one hand, a lack of information, and then on the other hand,
the fear of man. For the same reason that they don't believe in a lot of the things that the Bible says are literally true, literally history and literally science, the fear of looking silly and the intimidation by people who host science television shows and wear white lab coats. I think it's really that they're afraid of appearing silly in any way.
I wasn't afraid of looking silly. I really wanted young Earth creationism to be true. I only eventually rejected it because it couldn't hold up to scrutiny.
But when you actually go past the surface and look at the feasibility of it and the historicity of it, it's almost inescapably plausible.
Inescapably plausible isn't exactly a strong endorsement. Again, the movie's only shooting for plausible and not a higher standard of probable. They just want fellow young Earth creationists to not have to feel quite as silly as they do.
In the early 19th century, when the idea of millions of years was developed, it developed as a result of a conscious rejection of the flood and the biblical chronology. Most of the church came to the conclusion that the flood wasn't global, it wasn't really geologically significant, the age of the earth doesn't matter. And so over the next 100, 150 years, the flood was just kind of forgotten. And it still, in large measure today, is ignored by most Christians. They just never think of it and its relationship to the question of the age of the earth. But it's critically important.
The fact that most Christians maintain their faith without holding to a literal global flood means that the Bible can be easily interpreted without a literal flood. And it is also an admission the scientific evidence doesn't support a literal flood, because fellow Christians are motivated to want to accept it rather than reject it. If the believers doubt your flood evidence, I don't see why a skeptic should accept it.
The Lord God had made a beautiful world in which everything was once very good. But when the first man broke God's command, man's domain was plunged into sin and death, which only grew worse with the progression of time. Where once the earth had been filled with God's goodness, now was filled with the celebration of evil and endless violence. Paradise, along with men's innocence, was now gone.
The film's animated opening ends on an extended scene showing mothers carrying their babies upstairs only to drop them into burning cauldrons. They really need to demonstrate Genesis 6:5, which says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." They need the audience to buy into the fact that every human on the planet absolutely deserved to be drowned.
Most flood geologists point out that the world, the earth, had a more global, warm, mild climate. And the evolutionists believe that too.
Okay, 15 minutes in, and finally some science. The statement, the Earth had a more global, warm, mild climate in the past, is an oversimplification to the point of misrepresentation that fails to capture the complex climate history of Earth over its 4.5 billion year existence. There is so much data on this, but here's a paper, Earth's Climate History, from 4.5 billion years to 1 minute, from 2022, with some excellent summaries. A few key points refute Charles' notion. 1. Earth's temperature has fluctuated dramatically over billion-year timescales, from extremely hot, 60 degrees Celsius, warmer than today, in the early Precambrian, to ice ages in the more recent Quaternary period. There is no single mild past climate. 2. On shorter timescales, the climate has oscillated between glacial and interglacial periods, with temperature swings of 3 to 20 degrees Celsius. The Quaternary period, last 2.6 million years, has been characterized more by ice ages than globally warm conditions. 3. Within the current interglacial Holocene period, last 11,700 years, temperature reconstructions show the climate has not been uniformly warm, but has fluctuated by several degrees Celsius, including cooler periods like the Little Ice Age 4. Global temperature data over the past 140 years show a clear warming trend of about 1 degree Celsius emerging from the range of natural Holocene variability. Current temperatures are likely the warmest in thousands of years. Earth's climate history is characterized by significant swings between warmer and colder states on timescales from billions of years down to decades. Warm periods have alternated with ice ages, and there is no clear evidence that the past had a uniformly mild climate compared to today. The data strongly refute such a simplistic characterization of Earth's complex climate history. A successful flood model would need to account for all of the fluctuations, not merely cherry-pick a single point in the past that corresponds to their hypothesis.
It's not just because of continental drift that we find pine tree, forest, and dinosaur fossils on Antarctica. Not just because those continents were once in different places, but because the Earth had a warmer, milder, global climate, heavier, lusher vegetation, greener, thicker forest that stretched further towards the poles and away from the equatorial zones.
Modern young Earth argumentation is an exercise in choosing portions of scientific discovery that can map in some way to the ancient story to give the artifice of intellectual integrity, while simply ignoring the portions of the same discovery that contradict. The idea that continents have moved over time is well supported by numerous lines of evidence, including the fit of the continents, the distribution of fossils, and geological formations. This movement is driven by plate tectonics, and Charles is happy to casually embrace this notion. But those featured in Ark and Darkness can't accept the geological time that process requires, so they came up with catastrophic plate tectonics, compressing billions of years of movement into one. We'll get to that. But let's stick to dinosaurs in Antarctica. While it's true that Earth's climate was generally warmer when dinosaurs roamed, this doesn't fully explain the specific types of fossils we find in Antarctica. The fossils, including dinosaurs and lush forest remains, match what we'd expect to find in temperate, mid-latitude regions, not the polar extremes. If climate were the main factor, we'd see similar fossils in other polar areas, but we don't. The difference is Antarctica's past location. Geological evidence shows that Antarctica was once part of a supercontinent called Gondwana, situated much closer to the equator. As the continent slowly drifted apart over millions of years due to plate tectonics, Antarctica carried its dinosaurs and forests with it to its current South Pole position. Paleomagnetic data and fossil records from other continents support this, aligning with the timeline of Gondwana's breakup. The unique fossils in Antarctica are a direct result of its journey from a warmer, greener past to the icy landscape we see today. It's Antarctica's dramatic change in position that best explains the specific fossils found there.
Right now, we just don't have the kinds of forests that could generate the coal deposits that we have, or provided the vast source for the carbon that would have been necessary for the coal seams that we have today. We would have had to have had a lusher, warmer, more forested, more vegetated Earth.
The conditions required for coal formation include significant organic material accumulation in anoxic environments, low oxygen, which slows down decay and allows peat to accumulate and eventually transform into coal under heat and pressure over millions of years. Coal deposits formed primarily during the Carboniferous period around 300 million years ago, which was characterized by vast swampy forests in equatorial regions, which provided the organic material necessary for coal formation. Charles' assertion that current forests couldn't produce similar coal deposits is simply not accurate. Given the right conditions, today's forests could form coal over geological timescales. It's the conditions that are lacking, not the type or quantity of vegetation as Charles falsely represents.
Clearly, the amount of vegetation in the pre-flood world was far superior, far more luxuriant.
Earth's history has never been homogeneous in terms of vegetation. There have been periods of both lush vegetation and significantly less vegetation than we see today. There were almost 4 billion years of Earth time before the first land plants that we would consider vegetation emerged around 470 million years ago during the Ordovician period, early ferns, and the ancestors of modern trees. While certain periods, like the Carboniferous, about 359 to 299 million years ago, featured extensive plant growth due to specific climatic and atmospheric conditions. Other periods, such as during ice ages, saw much less vegetation.
Today's world is a desert by comparison to what the pre-flood world would have been like. A much gentler topography, a much easier climate, much more prolific vegetation and animal life.
The Earth's topography and climate have always been dynamic, shaped by geological processes like plate tectonics, volcanic activity, and natural climate fluctuations. The idea of a universally gentle pre-flood topography is not supported by geological evidence, which shows a history of varied and often extreme landscapes. While certain periods in Earth's history did have extensive vegetation and large animals, today's biodiversity is also prolific and complex. The fossil record shows a variety of life forms in different eras, each adapted to their specific environments.
We have many creatures in the fossil record that are just like today, but that were much larger. So giantism in the fossil record, that indicates that the pre-flood world was much more suitable for biological life.
There are examples of ancient creatures that were larger than their modern descendants. For example, megafauna like mammoths, but gigantism is not indicative of a universally better or more suitable environment. Rather, it reflects different environmental conditions, such as higher oxygen levels or different predator-prey dynamics. Gigantism in the fossil record indicates that different environmental conditions supported larger body sizes at certain times. However, suitability for life is not solely based on the size of organisms. Modern ecosystems are fully suitable to support a wide range of life forms adapted to current conditions. Andrew is making the mistake of conflating bigger with better.
Judge me by my size, do you? And where you should not.
When it comes to life forms, bigger tends to mean less adaptable, which is ultimately worse.
In almost computer-like fashion, the book of Genesis reveals that the post-flood lifespans of the genealogical line of Adam follow a mathematical concept known as exponential decay, meaning that if you were to graph the lifespans of all the men after the flood, you don't see a linear line gradually sloping down, as you would likely see if the ages were made up, but instead, what you see is an exponentially decaying curve with minor variations since no two people are alike. Would the men who recorded these ages through history really have conspired together to create data that follows an exponential decay curve? Instead, what we see resembles exactly the type of data we would expect in the aftermath of a worldwide flood.
Okay. So the film says that the charts of ages in the Hebrew Bible aren't figurative or invented because they roughly follow an exponential decay curve, thus demonstrating that the numbers must be really real. Not that I don't trust the film, but we shouldn't just trust every chart handed to us. I plotted the ages from Genesis and Kings, obtaining a similar graph. Analyzing the data, this exponential decay function fits with an R2 value of 0.90, explaining 90% of the variance. However, other models also fit well. A linear fit explains 68%, a quadratic fit 85%, and a cubic polynomial fit outperforms the decay curve at 94%. The preference for the decay curve may stem from its recognizable terminology, aligning with certain theological views about sin's effects. However, fitting an exponential decay curve doesn't inherently prove data validity or historicity. Many processes, including random generation, can approximate this pattern. Examples include cooling liquids, vehicle depreciation, and product sales decline. Different models can fit the same data, undermining the argument for the decay curve's uniqueness in supporting historicity. The model describes but doesn't explain the trend and lacks causal explanation. The claim that genetic mutations caused rapid lifespan decline lacks scientific support. Modern genetics shows gradual mutation accumulation over generations. Historical and archaeological data require contextual analysis beyond mathematical fitting. Scholars often interpret Genesis ages symbolically, representing completeness, virtue, or honor, consistent with other ancient Near Eastern texts. In conclusion, the exponential decay fit doesn't uniquely validate the biblical age data's historicity, and alternative interpretations should be considered.
When I was a master's student at Ohio State University, I looked at the geometry of the cross-section and of the length of just the straightforward reading of the Bible. And I found out that it's dynamically stable 90 degrees in pitch mode and 90 degrees in yaw mode. Meaning it'll go all the way up to 90 degrees and it'll come back. It's stable.
Not that that wouldn't have caused problems for the people and the animals in the ark if it had been tilted that much, but that does show the stability. Certainly whatever they could have taken in the turbulence, the ark could have taken structurally.
Modern shipbuilding uses advanced materials and precise engineering. The ark, as described in the Bible, would have been constructed from wood, which lacks the uniform strength and durability of modern materials. This significantly impacts its structural integrity, especially under extreme conditions.
This is a 200 scale arc, and I put it in my swimming pool, and we put a measurement device on here that was 1 inch, and so we were able to scale the waves. And do you know that it scaled to 500-foot waves, and it was still stable, never turned over. 500 foot. A tsunami, by the way, is about 100 feet. So it lets you know about the dynamic stability of this.
Real ocean waves, particularly those from tsunamis, have complex dynamics. Tsunami waves are not just high, but also have long wavelengths and periods, exerting enormous energy over extended durations, which would impose severe stresses on any vessel. Tossing an arc-shaped box into a swimming pool cannot accurately replicate ocean conditions. This anecdote is not reliable data on structural integrity and seaworthiness. Firstly, scale differences present a significant challenge. Proper model testing requires adherence to specific scaling laws, particularly Froude scaling, to accurately predict full-scale performance. Without correct scaling, the model's behavior cannot be reliably extrapolated to the full-size vessel. Secondly, material properties play a crucial role. The materials used in small models, often plastic or modern wood, do not accurately represent the properties of ancient woods used in historical vessels. Large wooden structures are susceptible to warping, cracking, and leaking, especially under the stress of oceanic conditions. Thirdly, environmental factors are grossly underrepresented in controlled pool settings. The complex interplay of oceanic currents, wave patterns, wind forces, and weather variations significantly impacts a ship's stability and performance. These factors cannot be adequately simulated in a swimming pool. Lastly, the structural complexity of real ships, including internal support systems crucial for distributing stress, is often oversimplified in small-scale models. To conduct proper ship design testing, naval architects and marine engineers employ more rigorous methodologies. They utilize accurate scaling techniques, particularly Froude scaling, to ensure proper force relationships between the model and full-scale vessel. Materials are carefully selected to simulate the strength and flexibility characteristics of the actual construction materials. Testing is conducted in specialized wave tanks, capable of generating various wave heights, lengths, and types to simulate real ocean conditions. Models are equipped with advanced instrumentation to measure stress, strain, and motion across different parts of the structure. Multiple tests are performed under a wide range of conditions, including extreme scenarios, to ensure comprehensive analysis. Computational fluid dynamic simulations complement physical testing, allowing for the prediction of vessel behavior under conditions difficult to replicate physically. While simplified model tests may have intuitive appeal, they lack the scientific rigor necessary for accurate predictions of a vessel's seaworthiness. True naval architecture relies on a combination of precise physical modeling, advanced testing facilities, and sophisticated computer simulations to ensure the safety and efficiency of maritime vessel designs.
Most of biology didn't need to be on the Ark. Most plants didn't need to be on the Ark.
If the entire Earth were covered with water for a year, it would be catastrophic for terrestrial plant life. Most plants wouldn't survive, and recovery would be unlikely. Firstly, plants would suffer from oxygen deprivation. Waterlogged soil cuts off oxygen to roots, and anaerobic conditions create toxic substances. Secondly, light deprivation would halt photosynthesis, depleting plants' energy reserves. Algal blooms would worsen this issue. If it were saltwater, osmotic stress would dehydrate and kill most plants. Even after the water receded, soil salinization would hinder regrowth. Prolonged submersion would damage seed viability, exceeding the tolerance of most seeds and preventing germination. Flooding would cause soil erosion and nutrient leaching, leaving the land less fertile for regrowth. Finally, the ecological balance would be disrupted. Soil microbial communities would be destroyed, and invasive aquatic species might dominate post-flood. Only plants with extreme flood adaptations or extraordinary regenerative abilities might survive, but they'd be the exception, not the rule.
So the Bible doesn't say that Noah was to take 2 of every species onto the ark. It was to take 2 of every kind. The same word that's used in Genesis 1 that talks about God creating different kinds of plants and animals to reproduce after their kind.
Andrew's created kinds model is in direct opposition to mainstream science's Universal Common Ancestry model, or UCA. The strictest literalistic interpretations of Genesis do seem to advocate these kinds, but the ancient stories are all it has going for it. UCA is strongly supported by genetic similarities across species that follow a nested hierarchical pattern. Humans, for example, share about 98 to 99% of their DNA with chimpanzees. While proponents of created kinds might argue that a common designer would use similar designs, this doesn't explain the specific patterns we observe. Particularly telling are endogenous retroviruses, ERVs, and pseudogenes found in the same genomic locations across different species. These non-functional elements are better explained by inheritance from a common ancestor than by independent design. Moving to the fossil record, we see a clear progression of life forms over millions of years, including transitional fossils like Tiktaalik, which exhibit features of both ancestral and derived groups. This chronological sequence supports gradual evolution. The common designer argument struggles to explain why fossils appear in this specific order, which aligns with evolutionary predictions. Biogeography also supports UCA. The distribution of species around the world aligns with evolutionary processes. Unique species on islands often resemble nearest mainland species, suggesting evolution from common ancestors. While a designer could theoretically place similar species in nearby locations, UCA more parsimoniously explains why isolated regions have species resembling those in nearby areas, consistent with evolutionary dispersal and diversification. Homology and embryology provide further evidence. Homologous structures like the bones in a human hand, a bat's wing, and a whale's flipper indicate common ancestry. Similarly, the parallels in embryonic development across diverse species point to a shared evolutionary history. While a common designer could use similar structures, this doesn't explain the specific patterns of modification seen in evolution, which align with UCA predictions. We've also observed speciation events in real time, where new species arise from existing ones. This directly contradicts the idea of fixed, created kinds and supports ongoing evolution from common ancestors. Furthermore, natural selection, genetic drift, and other evolutionary mechanisms provide well-supported explanations for the adaptation and diversity of life. These processes are observed and tested both in nature and laboratories, offering robust support for the UCA model. While the common designer leads to common design's argument might superficially explain some similarities between species, it falls short when faced with the detailed patterns and evidence from multiple scientific disciplines. The Universal Common Ancestry model, represented by the Tree of Life, provides a more comprehensive and empirically supported framework for understanding life's diversity. It coherently explains the genetic, fossil, biogeographic, and anatomical evidence, offering a robust scientific model for the history and diversity of life on Earth.
Evolutionists often claim that it would not be possible to fit all of the species of life on Earth onto a ship the size of the Ark, even when factoring just how humongous Noah's Ark actually was. At roughly 50 feet high, 85 feet wide, and more than 500 feet long, the Ark is the largest wooden vessel known to have been built by man, with the USS Wyoming, a gigantic wooden schooner built in 1909, coming in at second at 450 feet long.
Rather than provide an example of the possible, the USS Wyoming merely highlights the never-solved scientific and engineering problems of constructing the specified Ark. Large wooden ships face issues with structural integrity, often flexing and twisting in rough seas, leading to leaks and potential failure. The Wyoming, despite being built with modern techniques, required constant pumping and eventually sank due to these problems. Building a larger vessel like the Ark using ancient methods would be even more challenging. The limitations of wood as a material, including its susceptibility to water damage and natural defects, further complicate the feasibility of such a massive structure. Constructing and maintaining a wooden vessel of that size has proven impossible with modern methods, let alone one family with ancient technology. If you want to say that God gave Noah supernatural engineering insight beyond the instructions the Bible preserves, or supernatural materials, or merely supernaturally held his otherwise inadequate boat together for a year, that's fine. But then stop pretending that this was a plausible task and just go with magic.
Yet, regardless of size, imagining how the Ark could fit 18 million species of all life on Earth is a rather elementary level way of understanding the excellent efficiency of the Ark's economy. The reality is that the sea creatures, insects, invertebrates, and plant species did not need to be included on the Ark. You see, God instructed Noah to only bring the vertebrate land animals.
The survival of sea creatures, insects, invertebrates, and plants during a year-long global flood presents significant challenges from a scientific perspective. Aquatic life would face drastic changes in water salinity and environmental conditions, which many species are not adapted to survive. For example, mixing of fresh and salt water would be lethal for many fish species adapted to specific salinity levels. Insects and invertebrates would lose their habitats and food sources, crucial for their survival. Most plants cannot survive long-term submersion, as they require sunlight for photosynthesis. Even if some seeds survived, the conditions for germination and regrowth would be severely compromised. The disruption of ecosystems and food chains would likely lead to massive die-offs across various species.
And when you simplify those animals to their genealogical class structure found in Genesis, which is known as a kind, you can further significantly reduce the number of animal kinds needed down to around roughly 1,400 kinds, or approximately 6,750 animals in total.
To achieve current biodiversity from 1,400 animal pairs in 4,400 years, over 4 new species would need to emerge daily. This rate far exceeds observed natural speciation rates. For context, new bird species typically arise at about 1 per million years per lineage. Such rapid diversification faces significant challenges. 1. Genetic limitations, starting from so few individuals, would severely restrict genetic diversity, hindering adaptability and increasing inbreeding risks. 2. Ecological constraints. New species evolve to fill available niches. The emergence of millions of species in just 4,400 years would require an unprecedented rate of niche creation and ecological change. 3. Competition. Rapid species emergence would lead to intense competition and likely higher extinction rates. This proposed rate of speciation is not supported by our current understanding of genetics, ecology, and evolutionary processes. While the Ark narrative is intriguing, the scientific evidence suggests that such rapid diversification from a limited number of animal pairs is highly improbable. It's important to consider these biological factors when examining historical accounts.
Of those animals, you also don't need to bring fully mature adults, when smaller juveniles would fit better, eat less, waste less, and live longer while reproducing in the post-flood world. With roughly 6,750 animals on board the Ark, we can now also estimate that approximately 1,400 cages were needed. And when considering that only 20% of the Ark's volume was needed for food storage, you can see that we have plenty of room left over for cages and infrastructure with the remaining area able to fit the equivalent of 483 semi-trailers within its volume.
Gathering the food ahead of time and keeping it fresh seems far more problematic than the space needed to house it. If God is involved, I guess you can go with God kept the food fresh, but again, this movie isn't needed to plead for naturalistic plausibility of the project. It would seem smarter for God to miraculously make the animals all eat the same small pellets for a year, or better yet, not need food for a year, or better yet, just go to sleep for the whole year and wake up on the other side, like portrayed in the Hollywood Noah movie. Creationists should embrace the supernatural.
But as compelling as the science behind the ark is, we must not forget that it is God who orchestrated the events. It was God who decided the time to judge the world had come. And it was God who was ultimately responsible for the deliverance of all who were aboard the ark.
That's what I'm talking about. Just say God did it, and you don't need a long movie with problematic and misleading scientific claims.
The global nature of the flood is given in the biblical text, and it's quite clear.
First, we could talk about the flood itself, the purpose of the flood. Contrary to what many think, it was not simply to destroy sinful man, but also, Genesis 6 tells us, to destroy all the land animals and birds, not in the ark with Noah, and to destroy the surface of the earth. And only a global flood would accomplish that purpose. Then we can talk about the ark. The purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. It was, as Genesis 7:3 says, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth.
When the scripture says that the waters rose to about 24 feet above the mountains, even if you give the idea that the mountains were not as high as they are now, they were upthrust after the flood, you still have water only rising to its own level. If we had a local flood, then obviously there's no need to build an ark.
If the flood was local in the Middle East, the ark was totally unnecessary. The animals didn't need to go in there. And he could have told Noah and his family to go on a vacation to Europe or Egypt. Only a global flood fits the purpose of the ark.
Among the religions that utilize the book of Genesis, there is significant debate over whether the authors of the book were describing a local flood or a global flood. The movie obviously advocates for the latter, but it is outside the scope of this response to try to impose scripture interpretation. But it is worth noting that there are devout Christians and Jews and Muslims who feel that a local flood is the better interpretation, something you might want to investigate for yourself if you're similarly unpersuaded by the rationalizations this movie puts forth.
Well, if the flood was just a local event, then what do you think? Maybe when Jesus returns, just a local event? No, it's going to be a worldwide judgment as well.
And I would add one last thing, and that is we can't find the Garden of Eden. People look at the description of the geography where the Garden of Eden was in Genesis 2. The reason we can't find the Garden of Eden is because the pre-flood world was completely destroyed. It is now buried under thousands of feet of sedimentary deposits. So the flood was not a local flood.
The more plausible explanation as to why the Garden of Eden can't be found is that the story was similarly a mythical allegory that isn't meant to be taken as literal history.
Everything that is on the earth shall die.
Every non-flood geologist on our planet believes that the planet Mars had a global flood. Creationists do believe, like the unbelievers, like the secular geologists believe, Mars did have a flood. We think it happened the same time our flood did. Maybe an asteroid storm hitting the inner planets, the rocky planets. Here on our planet, we're now currently covered 70% with water, 2 miles deep, and they can't buy that we once had a flood. It's very, very easy for them to believe that Mars had a global flood, but for some reason they can't accept there's plenty of evidence that we've had a flood.
No notable scientists suggest that Mars had a global flood. From sources like satellite imagery, rover observations, and mineral analysis, scientists have found evidence of both catastrophic flooding events and long-term water presence on Mars. This includes large outflow channels, valley networks, and minerals that form in water. However, these findings point to localized events or regional water bodies, not a global flood. Water is not synonymous with flood.
The most asked questions are, where did the water come from for the flood and where did it go? And the answer is easily explained in the model of catastrophic plate tectonics.
The process of catastrophic plate tectonics is very similar to conventional plate tectonics. The main difference is the speed or the rate at which these processes unfold. Today, the plates are moving about a few inches per year. However, during the flood, 1 billion times faster.
Oh, now we're getting to the geology portion of the movie. As always on this channel, I prefer to defer to geology enthusiast and expert, Dr. Stephen Bauman, when this happens. And conveniently, the movie offered no new arguments in this area, so we can flash back to our already produced responses.
And Steve Austin, he's one of the proponents of catastrophic plate tectonics, where he tries to tell you Pangea broke up in some of that time too, plates moving at 2 meters per second, which is ridiculous. You can't do that. Physics doesn't allow for that.
So this concept of catastrophic plate tectonics, moving plates at 2 meters per second, isn't possible. You can't take a solid object and another solid object and jam one into another really fast, really hard, without creating dire side effects. A perfect example of this is take your hands, put them together, rub them slowly. You know, they pass alongside one another pretty easily. Now start rubbing your hands together really, really fast. What happens? You generate heat, okay? Or another analogy would be if you were pushing a car. You can put a car into neutral, even though the car weighs far more than you do. It's much more massive than you. And push it down a road. You can do that by yourself. But what happens if you run at that car really fast and it's in neutral and just plow into it to try to move it? You end up on your hind end. The car doesn't go anywhere. This is physics. And geology, like any other form of science, is subject to the laws of physics. The fact that there's no mechanism doesn't seem to bother young Earth creationists. See, that's the whole thing with this whole concept of catastrophic plate tectonics, is it's talked about. But where are the models? Yeah, they sit there and say 2 meters per second. Oh yeah, this does this. But where's the maths? Where's the predictions? What can I test? That's never given, and they don't give it because they know it's easily falsified. I mean, I don't even need to run the experiments. Basic physics tells me it's not possible. But if you don't know anything about physics, they can lead you down a rabbit hole.
Catastrophic plate tectonics faces many challenges when compared to what scientists have discovered about Earth's history. It doesn't explain how continents could move so fast without causing major problems, like melting the Earth's surface or using up impossible amounts of energy. Evidence from the ocean floor and places where continents meet suggests that these changes happened slowly over millions of years, not quickly. The way fossils are arranged in rock layers and how they show gradual changes in living things over time doesn't fit with the idea of one big, quick event. Many rock layers show signs of forming slowly over long periods, not rapidly during a flood. Most scientists who study the Earth disagree with this idea because it doesn't match up with the large amount of evidence we have about how our planet works and has changed over time.
You can't just try to incorporate all this stuff into 1 year. Earth would not survive this, Eric. It wouldn't survive this if it took 1,000 years, all right? If it took 100,000 years. You can't do this in 1,000,000 years either. Earth wouldn't survive this.
When the flood began, it began with these fountains on the bottom of the deep ocean.
Where the Bible even says the fountains of the great deep were opened up. The mid-ocean ridge, it's 44,000 miles long. Most of it is underwater. That's why they call it the mid-ocean ridge. And if it all erupted at the same time, it would have made the ocean floor do this, wow, and then the mid-ocean ridge would have erupted all around the world at the same time, roughly.
The idea that a great flood was caused by the simultaneous eruption of mid-ocean ridges, leading to raised sea levels, is not supported by scientific evidence. Mid-ocean ridges are underwater mountain ranges formed by the movement of tectonic plates. As these plates slowly move apart, magma rises from deep within the Earth, creating new oceanic crust. This process, called seafloor spreading, happens gradually over millions of years, not suddenly or all at once. We can see evidence of this slow, steady process in the magnetic patterns on the ocean floor. These patterns show that new crust forms symmetrically on either side of mid-ocean ridges, recording changes in Earth's magnetic field over time. Additionally, by dating rocks on the seafloor, we find that they get progressively older as we move away from the ridges, further supporting the idea of continuous, gradual seafloor creation. The Earth's crust maintains a delicate balance, slowly adjusting to changes in weight distribution, such as the formation or melting of ice caps. A catastrophic flood would disrupt this balance in ways we don't observe in the geological record.
When the fountains of the great deep broke open, as the Bible describes, that's the description of the fracturing of the pre-flood crust. You've got molten material that's expanding as it solidifies. The new ocean floor expanded. That pushed up sea level. That means that the ocean floor is actually going to rise. The ocean waters rose up to cover the continents.
Volcanic activity at these ridges does occur, but it's localized and doesn't happen simultaneously across all ridges. When magma emerges underwater, it cools quickly, forming distinctive pillow-shaped lava structures. This process contributes to the growth of the ridges over time, but doesn't cause rapid global sea level rise. Sea levels do change, but these changes are typically slow, occurring over thousands to millions of years. Factors like melting glaciers, warming oceans, and gradual tectonic movements influence these changes. Geological records, including sedimentary layers and ancient coral reefs, don't show any evidence of a sudden worldwide flood. Moreover, the distribution of water on Earth is regulated by the water cycle, which maintains a balance between oceans, ice, rivers, and the atmosphere. This system doesn't support the rapid addition or removal of vast amounts of water needed for a global flood. While the idea of a great flood caused by erupting mid-ocean ridges might seem plausible at first glance, it doesn't align with the scientific evidence we have from geology, oceanography, and climate studies.
The new ocean floor cooled and it shrank, and therefore sea level fell and the ocean waters drained off. The flood waters are still present on the Earth's surface today. They went into the new ocean basins that were produced as a consequence of the flood. In fact, the Earth is still 70% covered in water.
Yeah, the water's still here. It's deep in those trenches. Some of the trenches are 8. Now we find out 10 miles deep. If we had lower land formations and a higher ocean floor, we would probably be a water planet today with no land surface. And it's scraping the bottom of the barrel to try to say, where did all the water go? It's still here and it's very easy to explain.
The idea that underwater trenches and basins house a significant portion of Earth's water is not accurate. In reality, Earth's water is distributed quite differently. About 96.5% of all Earth's water is contained in the oceans. This water isn't concentrated in deep trenches or basins, but rather spread across the expansive ocean floors. While ocean trenches are indeed deep, they are relatively narrow and don't significantly increase the overall volume of water stored in the oceans. Ocean basins, on the other hand, are the large depressions that form the foundation of the oceans. These basins hold most of the ocean's water, but it's important to note that this water isn't concentrated in deep pockets. Instead, it's spread across vast areas with varying depths. The bulk of our planet's water is found spread across the expansive oceans, with smaller amounts in ice, underground, and in other forms on the surface and in the atmosphere.
We're all familiar with the theory about Pangaea, which holds that the continents were once connected to form a supercontinent that later broke apart through a process called plate tectonics. Catastrophic plate tectonics is essentially the same idea as conventional plate tectonics, except that the timeline and events are all centered around the year of the flood instead of millions of years of slow processes.
Young Earth creationists like to talk about that. Pangaea, it's split apart. It fits our catastrophic plate tectonics model. Well, it's not the only one. Before Pangaea, there was a similar continent about 1.1 billion years ago called Rodinia, and that would eventually break up and then form Pangaea eventually. In order to identify and construct the position of continents from long, long ago, we use something called paleomagnetism. Many of you are probably familiar, and Young Earth creationists will admit this, that, you can get paleomagnetic data from the ocean crust. But you can also get it from the continental crust. A friend of mine, she does this. She studied the Keweenaw dikes in North America and in India to help reconstruct the supercontinent Rodinia 1.1 billion years ago. Yes, we don't have ocean crusts from that long, but we do have these dike swarms they usually exist in. And as long as they're unaltered, you can take a core sample, and you have to know its orientation when you do it, and you can definitely get its paleolatitude. And you may sit there and go, well, how do we know the Earth had a dipole system a billion years ago? Well, because we can form what's called tracks. We compile this data, and they move in nice curves about the Earth's surface over time. This shows us that plate tectonics was in operation, continents were moving, but the fact that it's not scattered randomly shows us we had a dipole magnetic field. This extends to about 3 billion years ago. So that's how we reconstruct things like Rodinia, which predates Pangaea. And I never hear young Earth creationists say anything about this. Then there's other supercontinents that are even older than that.
Which should remind you of the name of the Genesis Apologetics source video, which openly specifies from Pangaea to today. They're specifically telling us that they are ignoring Rodinia and all the data from before Pangaea, because that would make their hyperfast tectonics model seem even less likely.
You may be surprised to learn that it was a man named Abraham Ortelius, a famous cartographer from the 1500s, who first proposed the idea that the flood of Noah may have been responsible for tearing apart the Americas from Europe and Africa. Hundreds of years later, another Christian by the name of Antonio Snider Pellegrini would first theorize the modern concept of continental drift, in which he illustrated two maps depicting the continents of the world as once joined together. This was decades before German geologist Alfred Wegener would propose his own version of the theory, known today as Pangaea, and be erroneously dubbed the father of continental drift. Antonio was snubbed of this honorary title. His crime was citing the book of Genesis, in which he said he made the discovery that at the beginning of creation, there was only one continent.
The notion that Antonio Snider Pellegrini was the first or most significant proponent of continental drift is inaccurate. The idea has a rich history dating back centuries, with numerous thinkers contributing to its development long before Pellegrini. As early as 1596, Abraham Ortelius observed how continents seemed to fit together like puzzle pieces. Over the following centuries, others like Francis Bacon, the Comte de Buffon, and Alexander von Humboldt made similar observations about coastline shapes or biological similarities across distant lands. Pellegrini's 1858 work proposing joined continents was largely overlooked, but not because of its biblical associations. The primary reason was its lack of empirical support and a plausible mechanism for continental movement. This was during a time when geology was becoming increasingly rigorous, emphasizing evidence-based theories. The limited recognition of Pellegrini's work reflects the broader challenges faced by early continental drift theories, including Alfred Wegener's more comprehensive 1912 proposal. Both struggled for acceptance primarily due to the absence of a credible mechanism for continental movement, not because of any religious undertones. It wasn't until the mid-20th century development of plate tectonics theory that continental drift gained widespread acceptance, leading to a reevaluation of earlier ideas in light of this new understanding.
The most compelling evidence for a global flood is the sediment record itself. All over the earth, what's under your feet, hundreds of distinct horizontal layers, generally with smooth interfaces between the layers. The only way that such a record could have come into existence is global scale processes producing the whole record in a single global event.
The idea that sedimentary rock layers can only be explained by a global flood is not supported by scientific evidence. Sedimentary rocks form through the gradual accumulation and compaction of sediments over long periods. These layers often appear horizontal due to gravity's effect on settling particles. Geologists have identified numerous local and regional processes responsible for creating sedimentary layers, including river and ocean deposition, lake sedimentation, and wind-blown material accumulation. These processes occur continuously over millions of years, shaping the Earth's surface without the need for a single catastrophic event. Different environments produce distinct types of sedimentary layers. For example, river deltas, beaches, deserts, and ocean floors each create unique patterns in the rock record, often containing specific sediment types and fossils characteristic of their formation conditions. If a global flood had occurred, we would expect to find a single, uniform layer of sediment covering the entire planet, showing signs of rapid, catastrophic deposition. Instead, the geological record reveals a diverse array of sedimentary environments with varying deposition rates and conditions. Furthermore, the fossil evidence within these layers demonstrates a gradual progression of life forms over time, aligning with the slow, steady processes of evolution and geological change rather than a sudden worldwide event.
All over the world, the layers are flat and there's no river channels in them. Think about what you see at the Grand Canyon. You see these flat pancakes, one on top of another, just flat, 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 flat.
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 Flat? Basically erosionless. Here's how they formed. At the beginning of the flood, there was movements of the crust. Crustal movements actually cause earthquakes. Earthquakes in water cause tsunamis. The tsunamis, then originating from the ocean areas, would then race across the continents.
In order to get earthquakes strong enough to create tsunamis where the waves are hundreds of meters high, well, you're going to need a magnitude, if I remember correctly, it's like a 13 or 14 in order to generate tsunamis that are like 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers high. And those type of seismic forces would literally rip the planet apart. The impact that created the moon wasn't even a 14, okay? We're talking about planetary destructive forces here that, other than, well, God willed it to hold together, it violates every law of physics that we know, every experiment we've ever done, anything we've tested. It flies in the direct face of everything that we know about physics and chemistry and geology. You just can't create those kind of earthquakes without destroying the planet. And the Earth inside does not have that kind of potential energy to even generate those type of earthquakes anyway. Okay? It's just not a physical possibility.
My simulations indicate that these tsunamis were large enough for a single tsunami to sweep all the way across a continent.
These layers were formed underwater. That's why they were so confusing to so many people.
Tsunamis, while powerful, typically leave localized deposits in coastal areas rather than uniform layers across continents. These deposits are often chaotic and mixed, containing various sizes of sediment and debris. In contrast, the flat and extensive layers seen in many sedimentary rocks are more likely the result of gradual deposition in calm environments like deep ocean basins or lakes. Erosion, a natural process where materials are worn away by wind, water, or ice, is an important part of the sedimentary cycle. The absence of erosion between some layers is better explained by continuous deposition in stable environments rather than by repeated tsunamis. Geological evidence, including sediment core analysis, radiometric dating, and fossil examination, supports the idea of gradual deposition over long periods. Deep-sea sediments, for example, often result from the slow settling of fine particles from ocean currents, dust, and biological activity over millions of years. Other geological features, such as turbidites, underwater landslide deposits, and graded bedding, provide further evidence for various sedimentary processes that don't require a global flood. The fossil and mineral content of sediment layers also offer clues about their origins and the environments in which they formed.
It's fascinating to see the evolution scientists explain their dig sites. For example, at Dinosaur Provincial Park, they have 10,000 dinosaurs buried in this flat layer. And you ask the site paleontologist, well, how did these 10,000 dinosaurs get in this flat layer? Well, they died in a river in flood. oh, what was the shape of the river bottom? It was a flat river bottom. So you're saying this river that was so strong that could bury 10,000 dinosaurs over 5 miles wide, which would be a raging river, wasn't strong enough to cause an erosion channel? Why isn't there a river cut from this river channel? Why isn't there erosion from that river? The answers make no sense.
The dinosaur fossils at Dinosaur Provincial Park were not buried in a single flood event, but rather represent complex sedimentary processes occurring over millions of years during the late Cretaceous period. The park's layers formed in various environments like rivers, floodplains, and deltas, creating ideal conditions for fossil preservation through rapid burial. The absence of prominent erosion channels is consistent with floodplain environments, where sedimentation can fill and obscure channels over time. The park's stratigraphy reveals changing environmental conditions, with layers of sandstone, mudstone, and coal, indicating long-term sedimentation in a river-dominated landscape. Taphonomy supports this interpretation, emphasizing the importance of rapid burial for fossil preservation. Research into the park's paleoenvironment suggests a diverse landscape with varied habitats, explaining the rich fossil record. Modern analogs, such as the Mississippi River Delta, demonstrate how dynamic sedimentation can create extensive layers without preserving significant erosion channels, which helps us understand the processes that occurred at Dinosaur Provincial Park millions of years ago.
In light of this flat problem, the erosionless problem,
what we see at the Grand Canyon is that the layers got bent at the edge of the plateau. Because the folding was smooth when the sediments were still soft, the whole sequence had to be formed rapidly during the flood and then bent at the end of the flood while they were still wet. And so these folds are very strategic evidence tying together all the layers, and it emphatically demonstrates that the millions of years never happened.
Now, all right, any of you ever made a peanut butter jelly sandwich? You ever try to bend it? I don't know if you have. If not, imagine it. What's going to happen to peanut butter and jelly? It's going to move. This is your peanut butter and jelly. This is your bread. This got deformed probably already during metamorphism. All right. Remember, it's low grade. So something's got to bend. Something's got to flow, compensate. This is too tough to do that. This was too hard. Tough, hard. We'll go with those terms. All right. But this could move a little bit. So you develop foliations. Okay. This is not primary bedding. This is a later deformational structure. Remember I said, remember that 50 to 60% dip? Now this is pretty level. Well, what do you think the dips on those are? Probably around 50 to 60%, which is about the dip of our anticline. Now we would draw it on a line as a cross section, but it's a plane. That's not a coincidence. This happens a lot. It's more complicated than that. There's more stress fields involved. We're just going to go with that. Okay. I've taken you to a place in the Upper Peninsula of US 41 where the same thing is expressed and something similar with an expression of Pompeii's rule in it as well. So this happens a lot. And when they figured out these stress fields, that's one of the conclusions they came to, that this is a syncline and this kind of corresponds to the axial plane. And since this would bend and this would move up and this would move down relatively to one another, you're going to get dragging up here and down here. And it's reflective of the larger structure. That was one of those eureka moments Van Hise, Leith, and others had in the late 19th century here. Okay? And even others later. Okay? So this is where this was figured out, all right? This isn't just looking at rocks and going, ooh, let's make up their origin story, which is kind of the feel you get from young Earth creationist rhetoric. But when they're the ones actually making stuff up.
Or the fact that you have what are called polystrate fossils. They're usually trees that go through more than one layer.
It is a common creationist tactic to give a known scientific phenomenon a new name, so that when someone searches for the term, only creationist answers come back, and not the mainstream scientific answers. In this case, what creationists call polystrate fossils, science calls upright fossils, so adjust your Google searches accordingly.
These trees have 3 layers that are supposedly 30 million years worth of rock around them. You know that if you start accumulating sediment around the bottom, the sediment would eat away at the bark would rot, and the tree would die even sooner, would fall over even less than 100 years. But here we have trees, vertical, fossilized with 3 layers.
Upright fossils form through a process of gradual burial over time, rather than rapid catastrophic entombment. These fossils typically originate in environments prone to periodic flooding or sedimentation, such as river deltas, floodplains, or areas near volcanic activity. Some of the most famous are in Joggins, Nova Scotia, near where I live. plants or trees grow in place, and over years or decades, they are slowly buried by accumulating sediment from repeated local flooding events or volcanic ashfall. This gradual process allows the organism to remain intact and even continue growing as it's buried, evidenced by features like regenerative growth and undisturbed root systems extending into underlying soil layers. While some may view these fossils as evidence of a global flood, closer examination reveals several characteristics that actually refute this interpretation. First, the presence of delicate, intact root systems penetrating multiple sediment layers indicates in-place burial, rather than violent transport and deposition. Second, signs of regenerative growth in some specimens show that burial occurred slowly enough for the plant to continue living and growing between sedimentation events, impossible if submerged under miles of floodwater. Third, the fossils are often found in association with paleosols, ancient soil horizons, which require long periods of stable conditions to form. These features are inconsistent with the rapid, catastrophic burial expected in a global flood scenario. Additionally, we can observe similar burial processes occurring today in places like the Mississippi Delta, providing a modern analog for how these fossils form over time. While the idea of a global flood may seem to offer a simple explanation, the intricate details preserved in upright fossils actually point to a more complex but scientifically sound process of gradual burial in dynamic local environments. Check out this video from Gutsick Gibbon for a much more detailed explanation.
Evolutionists claim that the Earth is millions of years old, and one of their so-called proofs are stratified rock layers found within the geologic column. Evolutionists teach that each layer represents millions of years of rock formation based upon their uniformitarian view that says you can make assumptions about the past based upon processes today. But in doing so, you're assuming that there were no catastrophic events like a global flood.
I mean, this took 100 years to frost wedge away, okay? But it failed in a catastrophic event. Young Earth creationists like to use the word uniformitarianism when they're talking about geology. Uniformitarianism is a school of thought. It's not a scientific theory or hypothesis, and us geologists don't really use it anymore. And this is a perfect example of why, all right? Young Earth creationists keep using it, and they won't get away from it because they want to give the impression that everything geologists think happens, we think happens gradually. Well, it depends on your scale. It depends on the amount of time. It depends on things. But we have a uniformitarian type of, thing going on here. I could say that this rock face, this is the one that fell, this one. This, from a uniformitarianism standpoint, was stable for 100 years. And what would happen is water would get in here, freeze, and thaw, and push us a little further away, forming more cracks, more failures over time. But it catastrophically failed, okay? So it's not one event. You don't need, one catastrophic event to explain how this talus got here, because it happened over a period from when that wall was exposed from quarrying to 2014, 2015, that winter, all right? So it's a matter of scale, and it's a matter of event. This was a single event, and it was catastrophic. We know catastrophe happens in geology, like the Sudbury impact up in Ontario. That was kind of catastrophic. End of the Cretaceous impact, Chicxulub. We know that was catastrophic, all right? We know storms happen, okay? We know things like this happen. It's not unusual, okay? Uniformitarianism is preached and preached by young Earth creationists, but it's, like I said, it's not really something we use anymore because we know that uniformitarianism type things like frost wedging over 100 years. Now, if I step out of the geologic scale to a million years ago, that happened instantly. But from a human scale, the uniformitarian thing was the frost wedging going on. And then the catastrophe was the failure of that wall.
Evolutionists also ignore the flood evidence contained within these rock layers, like sea creatures mixed together with land creatures. Just ask any coal miner. Anywhere on Earth they dig, they find countless sea creatures embedded in the rock.
The presence of both sea and land creatures in rock layers is not evidence of a global flood, but rather the result of natural geological processes over millions of years. Fossil assemblages containing marine and terrestrial creatures often form in coastal environments like river deltas and estuaries, where ecosystems overlap and water levels fluctuate due to various factors. Geological processes, such as uplift, erosion, and sedimentation, can also mix marine and terrestrial fossils. Sea level changes throughout Earth's history have deposited marine sediments on what is now land. The fossil record shows a gradual succession of life forms over time, supporting evolutionary theory and deep time concepts. Radiometric dating and stratigraphic correlation provide a timeline for these changes, indicating Earth's age of about 4.5 billion years, with complex life evolving over the past 540 million years. Well-preserved transitional fossils offer evidence of gradual transitions between major organism groups.
You see, the Bible refutes evolution theory, stating that it has only been roughly 6,000 years since the beginning of creation, giving the true account of how the sedimentary layers formed, as sedimentary rock is rock that is formed in water, which is also incredible testimony of a worldwide flood, given that the Earth's surface is made up mostly of water-formed sedimentary rock layers. The fact that the layers were actually formed in water also explains why there is no erosion found in between the layers, as there would be if the layers took millions of years to form.
Sedimentary rocks are not evidence of a worldwide flood, but rather the result of diverse processes occurring over millions of years. These rocks form through accumulation and compaction of sediments in various environments like rivers, lakes, oceans, and deserts. Their characteristics, including crossbedding, ripple marks, and fossil assemblages, indicate different depositional settings rather than a single flood event. The absence of erosion between some layers can occur in environments with continuous deposition or low erosion rates, while unconformities show pauses in deposition and environmental changes. The geological timescale, based on rock layers, fossils, and radiometric dating, documents Earth's history over billions of years. Stratigraphy reveals patterns of deposition and environmental change, with fossils providing evidence of life evolving over long periods. Modern sedimentology studies support these long-term processes, showing how sedimentary layers form under varying conditions and timescales. This scientific understanding aligns with a dynamic planet shaped by natural processes over billions of years, rather than a single flood event.
Then there's the issue of bended and folded rock, which could only occur if the layers were pliable and soft at the time of the bending, which is exactly what a global flood would cause. The bent layers also prove that their formation was rapid, with multiple layers forming rapidly on top of each other, because the bottom layers would still have to be saturated with water and didn't have enough time to dry out. As forces acted upon the layers, they bent in unison from top to bottom. Claiming these layers folded together over millions of years while still forming cannot explain what geologists are observing.
Bent and folded rock layers are not evidence of a global flood, but rather the result of tectonic forces acting over millions of years. Geologists explain these formations through ductile deformation, where rocks bend without breaking under high pressure and temperature deep within the Earth's crust. This process occurs in solid rocks, contrary to the claim that the layers must have been soft or pliable. Examples like the Appalachian and Alpine mountain ranges demonstrate these slow geological processes, including sedimentation, rock formation, and tectonic deformation. Sedimentary rocks form through gradual accumulation and compaction of sediments. Folded layers indicate later deformation of solidified rock, not rapid deposition. Radiometric dating and stratigraphic studies support this slow process, aligning with our understanding of plate tectonics and geological timescales. Field observations and structural geology provide further evidence of these long-term processes shaping Earth's crust. These studies show that folds can be traced to specific tectonic events, consistent with established geological knowledge.
To further prove that these rock layers were formed quickly and in the flood is the fact that in countless places around the world we find polystrate trees. Poly meaning many, and straight referring to the multiple layers that these trees are running through. If you understand anything about how organic matter decomposes, you'll know that it's impossible for trees to remain intact for millions of years while layers of dirt and debris slowly pile around them, and rain and moisture rot the wood out. Instead, what the evidence shows is that trees were swept up in the flood and carried off, and as they became more waterlogged, they sank. Some trees would sink uniformly, while other trees contained more water saturation in what was left of their bottom roots. These trees would be bottom heavy and float down to the floor, but rest upright.
As I already addressed, polystrate trees are not evidence of a global flood, but can be explained by natural processes. These fossils typically form in environments like river deltas, floodplains, and coastal swamps with rapid and variable sedimentation rates. Rapid burial can occur during local floods, volcanic eruptions, or landslides, preserving trees before decomposition. In swampy environments, waterlogged conditions slow decay. Sedimentary layers can accumulate quickly in certain settings, creating the appearance of multiple layers around a polystrate fossil. The positioning of these trees can be influenced by water and sediment flow, often resulting in upright positioning due to local conditions. The geological context, including sediment types and associated fossils, aligns with known processes and doesn't require a global flood. Taphonomy explains fossil preservation conditions, while modern environments demonstrate how rapid sedimentation occurs. Stratigraphy provides evidence of changing environments over time, consistent with polystrate fossil formation.
Tsunami waves would carry in sediments that would bury the trees quickly in multiple layers. In fact, geologists discovered that the same sand from the eastern side of America had been carried in tsunami waves all the way to the west side of the continent. This explains how the rock layers contained fossils of sea creatures mixed in with land plants. And it also explains why the trees are missing their root systems, and most importantly, why the trees are found running straight through multiple rock layers that evolutionists are claiming are millions of years old.
While tsunamis can cause rapid local deposition, they don't form widespread sedimentary layers over vast regions. Most sedimentary rocks form through various processes over millions of years. The idea of coast-to-coast sand transport by tsunamis isn't supported by evidence. North America's diverse rock types are better explained by plate tectonics, the movement of Earth's crust over time. Marine and land fossil mixing often occurs where ecosystems meet, like estuaries. Fossilization happens gradually as organisms are buried and mineralized. Trees running through multiple rock layers usually form in areas with rapid local sedimentation. Missing root systems can result from decay or erosion.
Let's also not forget that some of these layers are the size of continents, indicating that these trees and rocks were laid down in a single and catastrophic event, and not local floods at different times.
Sedimentary basins, spanning large areas, form through gradual accumulation of sediments from rivers, lakes, and oceans. Geological formations typically consist of multiple layers, each representing a specific period in Earth's history. The fossil record within these layers shows a progression of life forms corresponding to known geological timescales, inconsistent with a single catastrophic event. Plate tectonics shapes continents and forms sedimentary layers. While catastrophic events can deposit sediments quickly, these are usually localized. The widespread layers across continents are better explained by gradual accumulation over long periods. If a single flood caused global sedimentation, we'd expect a uniform layer covering all continents. Instead, each continent has a distinct geological history, with layers varying in age, composition, and fossil content. These differences reflect diverse local environments and processes over hundreds of millions of years, supporting mainstream scientific understanding of Earth's geological features forming through complex long-term processes.
Today, we assume that fossils are a normal part of the cycle of life, since we see so many of them all over the world. Yet, fossilization is not what we observe at all when something dies today. Thankfully, dead matter does not fossilize today under normal conditions, but instead, God made dead matter to break down and return to the earth. The fact that we see so many fossils indicates that there was a worldwide event that caused mass fossilization of all life on Earth at one point in time.
Fossilization is a rare process requiring specific conditions like rapid burial and low oxygen levels. While uncommon today, it can occur in environments such as peat bogs or tar pits. Normally, organisms decompose, cycling nutrients back into ecosystems. The fossil record spans hundreds of millions of years, reflecting various environments and organisms across time. Mass extinctions didn't fossilize all life simultaneously. Many fossils result from localized events. The distribution of fossils provides evidence of gradual environmental changes over time, not a single catastrophic event. Sedimentary rocks, where most fossils are found, primarily form in water environments. The mix of marine and terrestrial fossils in some layers can be explained by sea level changes, or coastal environments where ecosystems overlap. These processes occur over long timescales and don't require a global flood.
The second most powerful evidence are the fossils that are in these sedimentary layers. To produce a fossil requires, in most cases, especially for the larger kinds of organisms, requires complete burial and rapid burial. And that automatically speaks of catastrophic conditions. So the fact that we find so many fossils so well preserved, many of them with evidence that the animals were buried alive, is another powerful evidence for a flood cataclysm.
While rapid burial is indeed important for fossil preservation, this doesn't necessarily imply a worldwide catastrophe. Fossils can form in various settings that provide quick burial, such as local floods, volcanic eruptions, or landslides. These events occur regularly over long periods, creating fossil-rich environments like river deltas, lakes, and shallow seas.
There's a lot of fossils in museums. In fact, the museums are full. They don't want any more fossils. The basements are full. Museums have collected 1 billion fossils. And scientists suggest that in the rocks, and you could find these, there are trillions of fossils. If you see an animal die along the side of the road, like a possum or a deer, pretty soon that deer or that possum is gone. The bones disintegrate, scavengers come, the mice eat the bones, the pelt falls apart. 10 years later, it's just dust. There's nothing. And yet there's these trillion fossils. Here's why we have a trillion fossils. There was this enormous flood. It was a worldwide flood. Tsunamis were racing across, bringing in sediment and quickly burying these animals.
The abundance of fossils in the geological record aligns with the concept of gradual accumulation over millions of years rather than a single flood event. Fossils are found in layers of sedimentary rock that represent different environments and time periods in Earth's history. This variety and distribution support the idea of deep time, where geological processes occur over vast spans.
The one thing we frequently observe is that the fossils have been exquisitely preserved. What do I mean by that? Well, we find all the details preserved in place. For example, fish about to swallow another fish, and it's been buried. That tells you it had to be very rapid to preserve those details.
Exceptional fossil preservation, such as fish caught mid-meal or marine reptiles giving birth, can happen in oxygen-poor environments that prevent decay and scavenging. These conditions often occur in deep lakes or ocean floors, where sediments slowly cover organisms. However, such well-preserved fossils are rare and not representative of most fossil finds.
It may surprise you to learn that all of the rock layers of the world, the named rock layers like the Cambrian, the Jurassic, all of the layers of the world have saltwater creatures. Well, what greater proof would you need that this was from a worldwide flood, that there's saltwater creatures in all the layers? Now, this is in the middle of the continents. How did these saltwater creatures get here? It would have to be a flood. Now, the evolution scientists have to explain where these saltwater creatures came from, how they got there.
The presence of marine fossils on continents can be explained by changes in sea levels over time due to plate tectonics and climate fluctuations. For instance, parts of North America were once covered by shallow seas, resulting in marine sediments being deposited far from current coastlines.
Occam's razor would say, it's more simple to believe in one flood than more than a dozen worldwide floods.
While Occam's razor suggests favoring simpler explanations, it also requires accuracy and evidence. The theory of plate tectonics combined with known sea level changes provides a well-supported explanation for fossil distribution and sedimentary rock formation. This understanding is backed by multiple lines of evidence, including radiometric dating, fossil succession, and mineral distribution.
It was in the 1980s that the secular geologists began to move to catastrophism and move away from uniformitarianism as soon as it suited their needs. They went to catastrophism when it served their purposes to help explain the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Noah's flood provides a better explanation for the demise of the dinosaurs than the impact in Yucatan.
Scientific understanding of Earth's history incorporates both gradual and catastrophic processes. Contrary to the claim that geologists only recently embraced catastrophism, the principle of uniformitarianism, introduced in the 19th century, suggests that natural laws have remained consistent over time. This doesn't exclude sudden events, but recognizes that both slow changes and rapid occurrences have shaped our planet. For instance, the discovery of the Chicxulub impact's role in dinosaur extinction demonstrates how scientific theories evolve with new evidence, integrating both gradual and sudden processes in Earth's past. The extinction of dinosaurs is better explained by the Chicxulub asteroid impact than by a global flood. A clear boundary in the fossil record, known as the Cretaceous-Paleogene KPG boundary, shows a dramatic shift in fossil types about 66 million years ago. This coincides with evidence of a massive asteroid strike in the Yucatan Peninsula, supported by global findings of iridium-rich clay, shocked quartz, and spherules at the KPG boundary.
Simply because that event is so small, so localized, there's no way it could have a physical effect that would cause the dinosaurs to be buried the way we find them. And nobody in the secular world even claims that. They say, well, it produced climate change that caused the dinosaurs to starve to death.
The Chicxulub impact was a global event with far-reaching consequences. It released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs, causing widespread fires, a nuclear winter effect, and significant climate change. These effects disrupted ecosystems worldwide, leading to the extinction of about 75% of Earth species, including non-avian dinosaurs. Geological evidence of this impact has been found in multiple locations around the world.
If you go to a museum today and look at the dinosaur displays, you'll notice that the animals look strange and unusual with the dinosaurs. Have you ever seen a boa constrictor at a museum display wrapped around a T-Rex's leg? No. But they have found boa constrictors with dinosaurs. Have you ever seen a box turtle at the feet of a Stegosaurus? No, but they found box turtles with dinosaurs. Have you ever seen a T-Rex with a duck flying over him? No, but ducks have been found with dinosaurs. All 7 groups of animals today have been found with the dinosaurs, and they look the same. Museum displays don't show that. So if they actually put the animals they found with the dinosaurs, people would look at those displays and say, well, evolution hasn't occurred, it's just the dinosaurs went extinct. But scientists have withheld the modern animals from their dinosaur displays to promote the idea that evolution occurred.
The fossil record provides a rich tapestry of Earth's history, revealing both ancient creatures and ancestors of modern animals. While museums often showcase iconic dinosaurs, paleontologists have indeed discovered fossils of animals resembling modern species alongside dinosaur remains. This coexistence, however, doesn't contradict evolutionary theory. Evolution is a gradual process of change over time, not a sudden replacement of one group by another. Some lineages may persist with minimal visible changes, while others diversify or go extinct. The presence of ancient reptiles or birds alongside dinosaurs demonstrates the complexity of past ecosystems rather than disproving evolution. It's important to understand that evolutionary changes can be subtle, involving genetics, physiology, or behavior, not just outward appearance. Modern-looking animals found in dinosaur-era fossils have still undergone millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, even if their overall form seems similar. Scientists openly discuss and document these findings in peer-reviewed literature. The idea that such information is withheld to promote evolution is a misconception. In fact, these discoveries contribute to our understanding of life's history on Earth and are integral to evolutionary studies. Museum displays often focus on specific time periods or ecosystems to convey particular educational narratives. While they may not show every animal that coexisted, this is due to space constraints and the need for clear storytelling, not an attempt to mislead.
You know, the soft tissue analysis in dinosaurs that's been recent has been a little bit of an enigma to those who believe that the Earth and the universe is really old. Mary Schweitzer in the 1990s and the early 2000s first found this like elastic material in arteries. Elastic material means you pull it and it reloads back to its original place.
The discovery of soft tissue in dinosaur fossils, while surprising, doesn't contradict the understanding that these remains are millions of years old. Specific conditions like rapid burial and certain chemical environments can allow for this rare preservation. Iron particles and mineralization may act as natural preservatives, enabling some organic material to persist far longer than previously thought. Contrary to claims of concealment, scientists have been openly studying and publishing these findings in peer-reviewed journals. Researchers like Mary Schweitzer have been at the forefront of investigating soft tissue preservation, advancing our understanding of fossilization processes. The scientific consensus on Earth's age and dinosaur extinction timelines remains strong, supported by extensive evidence from multiple disciplines. Soft tissue discoveries, rather than overturning this understanding, demonstrate how science adapts to new evidence. Speaking of Mary Schweitzer, I once had an opportunity to interview her about how young Earth creationists were distorting her findings. Are you just clinging to an evolutionary paradigm, Mary?
There is always additional data out there waiting to be discovered that could disprove your pet hypothesis. If you're doing science correctly, that has to be acknowledged in all your work. So rather than trying to prove something in spite of the facts, you try to disprove using data and only data. And if you can't do it, it still stands. It's not this big cloudy mystery that scientists are just sitting in their lab trying to figure out how to destroy Christian faith. Why would God try to trick us? It's like, okay, we're going to give you a brain and we're going to make a world of order, because order is something God's known for. He's rational. He is consistent. So we're going to make this world of order, and then, wow, we're going to trick you by saying that all of the rules that you can figure out with your brain no longer apply. God's not the deceiver in this. And I think that young Earth creationists have to be really, really careful when they sit there and try to manipulate the data to support their worldview. That is not science. When I wear my science hat, I don't have beliefs. I have only data. It's very boring. But in the end, if my data is good enough, if my data are rigorous enough, if my data are repeatable enough, they can have their minds changed. And that is science. It isn't faith. That's science.
Well, a little bit later, Mark Armitage started looking at the horn of the Triceratops, but he found bone materials, tissue and bone, the osteocytes.
Mark Armitage, a microscopist, discovered structures resembling soft tissue in a Triceratops horn fossil. His findings, published in a peer-reviewed journal, included what appeared to be bone cells, osteocytes, and fibrous matrix. While these discoveries are intriguing, they don't necessarily challenge the established timeline of Earth's history. Scientists generally attribute such preservation to specific conditions that inhibit decay, like rapid burial and mineralization processes. These findings have sparked controversy, particularly in how they've been interpreted by those outside mainstream science. Some have used them to argue for a younger Earth, while the broader scientific community views them as rare examples of fossilization in ancient specimens.
Muscle tissue in the Santanaraptor fossil, and it was like dinosaur beef jerky on the leg bone of a dinosaur. It was the actual muscle.
The phrase dinosaur beef jerky was a metaphor used in popular media to describe the appearance of certain preserved dinosaur tissues. This analogy refers to the leathery texture of some fossils, but these tissues are not fresh. Over millions of years, chemical and physical changes alter organic materials, resulting in fossilized remains that may resemble dried-out tissue. The Santanaraptor, a theropod dinosaur from Brazil's early Cretaceous period, exemplifies exceptional fossil preservation. Its remains include mineralized soft tissues, like muscle fibers and possible blood vessels. These structures retain some original features, but have undergone extensive chemical transformation. In scientific research, precise terms like mineralized tissues or collagen fibers are used to describe these findings. Studies on such fossils provide insights into dinosaur biology and soft tissue preservation processes over geological timescales. Researchers use advanced techniques to analyze these fossils, confirming their age and preservation nature. This research helps understand exceptional fossilization conditions without challenging established geological timelines. It's important to distinguish between popular media descriptions and scientific terminology. For accurate information, consult original scientific papers and trusted resources, which detail the findings and their significance. Understanding this difference is key to appreciating these discoveries without misinterpreting their implications.
This Thescelosaurus bone is the same thing. We started looking inside of this bone, and we found using scanning electron microscopy that it had elastic material, it had tissue. You pull it apart, and it goes back. If this was mineralized or it was a fossil that became a rock, you couldn't do this. So it was never mineralized, never petrified. It was still elastic, meaning it was still the tissue. That means this thing is not 100 million years old.
When paleontologists find soft tissues in dinosaur fossils, they're not encountering fresh living material. Instead, they're discovering remnants of original biological structures that have undergone complex preservation processes over millions of years. These tissues, while showing some degree of flexibility, are partially mineralized and chemically altered. The preservation of these tissues involves several mechanisms. Iron from hemoglobin can act as a natural preservative, binding to proteins and protecting them from decay. Additionally, specific environmental conditions can contribute to the exceptional preservation of organic material within fossils. To study these preserved tissues, scientists use a weak acid solution to dissolve the surrounding minerals, revealing the embedded organic structures. This process can make the tissues appear more elastic, but this doesn't mean they're recent or unaltered. Rather, it's a testament to the durability of certain proteins, like collagen, which can maintain some of their structural properties over vast periods.
Now, Mark Armitage, working at University of California, did find soft tissue inside of a Triceratops horn, and when he published that finding, they fired him. So they are willingly ignorant, squelching the truth.
Mark Armitage was a part-time electron microscope technician in the California State University Northridge Sun Biology Department and gained attention for his research on a Triceratops horn fossil, where he reported finding soft tissue structures. Shortly after his research was published, Sisson terminated Armitage's employment, citing budget constraints and the temporary nature of his position. Armitage, however, believed he was fired due to religious discrimination and filed a lawsuit against the university. He argued that his dismissal was retaliatory and stemmed from hostility toward his religious beliefs, which some perceived as aligning with a young Earth perspective. In 2016, the lawsuit was settled out of court, with the terms remaining confidential.
In 1993, a film titled Jurassic Park featured a rather famous scene in which the remains of an ancient mosquito were preserved, encased in a ball of hardened amber. The film goes on to explain that the way scientists could resurrect dinosaurs from the past was by extracting blood from the remains inside this mosquito, in which dinosaur DNA could be fully sequenced, by combining what was missing with that of a modern-day frog.
We used the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the code. And now we can make a baby dinosaur.
What the Jurassic Park creators couldn't have imagined was the discovery of soft tissue inside of a dinosaur bone. A finding that has since been replicated by other scientists, such as this stretching Triceratops tissue, discovered by Mark Armitage. These discoveries shocked the entire paleontological community and would likely have rewritten the original Jurassic Park film had they known this was possible at the time.
The discovery of preserved soft tissues in dinosaur fossils doesn't provide a realistic means to extract or clone dinosaur DNA as imagined in Jurassic Park. The preserved tissues primarily consist of proteins such as collagen, not DNA. Proteins can survive for millions of years under specific conditions, but DNA is far less stable. It degrades over time due to environmental factors like heat, water, and microbial activity. The estimated half-life of DNA is only about 521 years under ideal conditions, making it extremely unlikely to find intact dinosaur DNA after 66 million years. Chemical reactions like hydrolysis and oxidation break down DNA nucleotide chains over time. Even in well-preserved fossils, any remaining DNA would be too fragmented and chemically altered to reconstruct a complete genome. Current scientific methods and technology are not capable of recovering and sequencing such ancient, degraded DNA.
In fact, of these 16 types of bioorganic materials that have since been discovered inside dinosaur bones, collagen by itself ends the debate on these bones being millions of years old, as the maximum age of collagen is as low as 10,000 years by some estimates and as high as 900,000 years by others, with 100,000 years being the generally agreed upon maximum age.
The discovery of preserved organic materials, like collagen and blood vessels in some dinosaur fossils, doesn't contradict established geological timelines, but rather highlights the complex processes of fossilization under exceptional conditions. Factors contributing to this preservation include rapid burial, mineralization, and stable geochemical conditions with low oxygen levels. Iron from hemoglobin can act as a natural preservative. While estimates of collagen's maximum age vary, recent studies show it can survive for millions of years under certain conditions, aligning with radiometric dating of dinosaur fossils.
Sadly, the Earth that was once a perfect habitat for dinosaurs was now irrevocably ruined, and those dinosaurs that were able to survive would be hunted to extinction over time. We know them as dinosaurs, but legend would remember them as dragons.
Dragon legends are prevalent in many cultures, but they don't stem from humans living alongside dinosaurs. Ancient peoples may have discovered large dinosaur fossils, misinterpreting them as remains of mythical creatures. Without modern paleontology, these findings could have sparked stories of enormous dragon-like beasts, living animals, particularly large reptiles like crocodiles or Komodo dragons, could have inspired some dragon legends. This is simple storytelling exaggeration. Dragons also often symbolize universal concepts like chaos, danger, or power in many cultures, reflecting common human storytelling archetypes.
There's been about 200 flood traditions discovered by anthropologists and missionaries and others. And many of these flood traditions come from people groups that don't even live near the ocean.
There are hundreds of flood legends from around the world, but in many of these cases, you have huge similarities to the biblical account. You have one righteous family that is saved, and the reason for the flood is because God was angry. The gods were angry at something that humanity had done.
They all talk about man and animals surviving on some kind of a boat. There are lots of similarities, but the true account is in Genesis.
The Genesis flood narrative shares notable similarities with earlier flood myths, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh. Both describe a divine flood to destroy humanity, with a righteous man chosen to build a boat and preserve life. Common elements include ark construction, family survival, animal gathering, bird release to find land, and the boat grounding on a mountain. These stories emphasize divine retribution, survival, and renewal. Noah is the hero in Genesis, while Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis, plays this role in Mesopotamian versions. The Gilgamesh epic dates back to around 2100 BCE, predating the Genesis account by centuries. The latter is believed to have been composed around the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, possibly during or after the Babylonian exile. The Genesis narrative adapts earlier polytheistic stories to a monotheistic framework, focusing on Yahweh and emphasizing moral reasons for the flood. Many scholars see literary influence from Mesopotamian texts in the Genesis account.
But on the plains of Shinar, men disobeyed God's command, and instead they came together to build a city and a great tower they intended to reach to the heavens in an ultimate act of rebellion and rejection of God. But God came down and put a stop to their tower by dividing their once unified language into many languages. And out of confusion and fear, they stopped building the tower and dispersed into what would become the nations of the world. It was within a few centuries after Noah and his family departed from the ark that the people of the world were of one language. But today, there are over 7,000 languages in the world, which trace back to an ancestral family group that each belongs to.
Linguists explain language evolution through evidence-based models reflecting natural historical processes rather than the sudden diversity described in the Tower of Babel story. Language evolution is seen as a gradual process where languages diverge over time due to geographic, social, and cultural separation. As people migrate and become isolated, their languages evolve in different directions, creating distinct languages and dialects. Languages are classified into families based on shared characteristics and traced back to common ancestors called proto-languages. For instance, the Indo-European family includes languages like English, Spanish, and Hindi, all traced to Proto-Indo-European. Languages change due to influences such as migration, trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, as well as internal processes like sound changes and semantic shifts. Archaeological findings and genetic studies provide evidence of language evolution and human migration patterns. Linguistic paleontology, which reconstructs ancient cultures through proto-language study, supports the gradual divergence model.
For example, Italian can be traced back to Latin, its root language family. However, when linguists attempted to trace the root language families further upstream, they encountered a serious problem. The language families would eventually lead to dead ends, otherwise known as language isolates.
On screen, the film shows 42 language isolates, and the chart shows that they clearly accept the notion of linguistic evolution. The film acknowledges 7,000 current languages. If we accept these numbers, we're to believe that from 4000 BC until now, there has been approximately one new language emerging per year. Every single year, a new language. This is the same problem they have with claiming all the current land animals evolved in a few thousand years from a few thousand pairs. It's simply too rapid to be realistic.
This directly contradicts the merged root language that evolutionists were expecting to find, or what some linguists theoretically call the elusive proto-world language.
The concept of a proto-world language, a hypothetical ancestor of all modern languages, is not widely supported by linguists. A major challenge is the lack of evidence for ancient spoken languages. Writing systems emerged only about 5,000 years ago, while human language likely existed for tens of thousands of years prior. This gap means many languages had already diverged before being recorded. By the time writing was invented, languages had developed distinct characteristics due to geographic and social isolation. Early writing systems typically recorded already diverse languages, reflecting a long history of independent evolution. Language evolution is complex, influenced by factors like migration and cultural exchange. This complexity makes reconstructing a single ancestral language unlikely. Instead, linguists focus on reconstructing proto-languages for specific language families, using similarities among known languages to hypothesize about more recent common ancestors.
And what's more is that these people groups also have myths and legends within their cultures of both an ancient flood that destroyed the world and a time when their ancestors attempted to build a tower. These stories, of course, vary, but the core elements tend to remain intact, with the Cherokee and other Native American tribes even including that their language was once changed much earlier in history, as only one example of hundreds. Only God's supernatural intervention can explain the multifaceted bottleneck we see across so many fields of science. It was at this event that God changed the entire course of human history once again. It was also after Babel that God instituted human government, and at a time when nationalism is being attacked by those wishing to establish a one-world government, it is important to remember that it was God who divided the world into nations.
Divided the world into nations as a punishment, not a reward. The Tower of Babel story, while culturally significant, is viewed by mainstream science and history as a myth rather than a literal account. Importantly, there is substantial evidence of organized governments that existed well before the alleged date of the Tower of Babel, typically estimated around 2000 BCE. For instance, the Sumerian civilization, circa 4500, 1900 BCE, in Mesopotamia, developed complex city-states governed by rulers called Lugals. Ancient Egypt was unified around 3100 BCE, establishing a centralized monarchy led by pharaohs. The Indus Valley Civilization, c. 3300-1300 BCE, showed signs of centralized authority through uniform city planning and standardized measures. The Akkadian Empire, circa 2334 to 2154 BCE, often considered the world's first empire, demonstrated early forms of imperial governance. Egypt's Old Kingdom, circa 2686 to 2181 BCE, saw highly centralized rule under pharaohs. Even early Chinese dynasties, like the Shang, circa 1600 to 1046 BCE, had well-documented governmental structures. Linguists explain the diversity of languages through natural processes of change and divergence over thousands of years, rather than a sudden divine intervention. Similarly, the formation of nations is understood to be influenced by cultural, historical, and geopolitical factors, rather than a single event. The concept of nationalism and the idea of nations as we understand them today are relatively recent developments in human history. Historically, people were organized into tribes, city-states, and empires long before the modern notion of nation-states emerged. That said, this film is addressing the same audience who would support Christian nationalism in America, so it makes sense to attempt to marry these concepts together.
When we come to the story of Noah's Ark, it's more than just a story. It certainly is a part of vital history. There was an ancient world, and that ancient world, because of corruption, was destroyed by a flood. And that was the judgment that was on mankind. Since man has not changed, there is yet a future judgment coming.
It'll be just as it was in the days of Noah.
Well, the last 10 minutes of the movie is devoid of scientific claims, rather focusing on a gospel presentation based on the theological grounding presented. It's worth noting that millions of Christians around the world agree on the theological points without having to resort to the straight-up science denial and misrepresentation of evidence that characterizes the ark and the darkness. Before you buy into the narrative of a movie, or a YouTube video for that matter, invest in your own knowledge and find out what the best minds on both sides have to say. Just a few years ago, I believed everything this movie said, but in searching for verification, discovered that I had been lied to by creationists. And so I am no longer a young Earth creationist. This has been a long one. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, later.